Well, folks, you know you're in for a treat when you hear that tune because it's time for another week of the Rec Poker Podcast. Thanks for joining me here on Monday night on YouTube. I have the best freaking job in the world because I get to hang out here every Monday night and talk with my poker friends about this fantastic game that we all love so much. My name's Jim Reed. I'll be your host tonight. I'm Bluffsterini in the Home Game Club. And while we've still got Twitter, I'm at Rec Poker Jim on Twitter. And if you want to find out more about me and the rest of the Wrecking Crew, you just got to head on over to rec.poker/crew and you can find out all about those smiling faces. But don't take it from me. You can listen up and hear from a few of them right here tonight on the show.
Well, I'm Chris Jones. You can find me 5B5 on Threads or 5x5 in the PokerStars home game.
And I'm Joe Coolis. You can find me at JoeCoolPhD on Twitter, cool with a K, or Elvita11 on the home game.
And I'm John Somsky. I am Poker Geek MN everywhere.
And I'm Keith Brandt, and that's Monkey System everywhere.
I'm Kim Kilroy. I am PetVet33, most platforms, Fergie56 in the home game, most of the time.
That's right. Kim's a jet-setting poker traveling champion, and you never know where she's going to be calling in from week to week. But we've got a packed house here for the Forums edition, which is just how I like it. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino, because without their support, we probably wouldn't be here right now. Most of what we do here is free, and so we're so appreciative of their support. And by the time people are listening to this, we'll just have wrapped up our last Rec Poker road trip to Running Aces, and I'm sure we had a great time, but I don't know exactly what we got up to yet, but I know it was a blast. So this is the Forums edition of the podcast. Like I mentioned, it's August, and the theme of the month in August is early stages of tournament play. So we're going to have a general conversation about that aspect of tournament play, strategic adjustments, what you can do, what you can't do. And this is just another one of Chris Jones's themes of the month. Every month we have a different learning theme here at Rec Poker. So Chris, you run a lot of the learning material that we do here, and you've kind of stacked this curriculum from month to month of different themes. We're entering kind of like a new chapter here in tournament stages. So tell us a little bit about why you chose to start here and what's so important about early tournament stages.
Well, I mean, we've talked about these kind of things off and on at various sort of things. We've talked about ICM. We've talked about, there's certain things. We've talked about final tables. But what we're going to do for our next 5 deep dives, so the next 5 months, is we're going to march our way through various tournament stages and really focus on some elements of play, what kind of dynamics change, how we can make adjustments as players. And I think it's really important to recognize that those things happen, that it's not just there's sort of like 3 things sort of like going on at the same time when we show up at a poker table. There's obviously the immediate kind of thing of like, what kind of cards do I have? What kind of, how does it interact with the board and all that kind of stuff. There's also what kind of players show up around me and how are they approaching their style of play. But I think there's also this sort of like thing that I think maybe is less. Some players are very cognizant of it, and I think others are maybe less so. That's governing how we kind of play, and that is, what stage of the tournament are we at? What are some of our incentives and goals, and what kind of things are pushing us to make different kinds of decisions based on where we're at in a tournament? So we're going to look at that piece by piece through the next few months.
Yeah, and I'm always struck by kind of this tension early in tournaments because you have a lot of chips. This is when stacks are deep. And so that, I think, inclines some players to play more speculative hands. But it also is a time when, you don't really want to bust. Well, actually, let's unpack that a little bit, because I think some people feel like they don't want to bust early in the tournament. Although I kind of feel like if you're not going to run up a stack and make the money anyway, then I'd kind of rather bust a little earlier rather than put in all those hours and then bust, a few levels before the money gets in. Can we talk just generally, Chris, when it comes to like strategic adjustments? Would you say that you should be playing like looser or wider earlier in the tournaments, or is there a different way of thinking about the way that you should be playing in that stage?
I wouldn't really use the words looser. I would use the words different. We're setting ourselves up to play more post flop poker, where there's going to be multi-street hands much more often. So we need to be cognizant of the kinds of hands we're bringing into those sort of environments, right? And like what that means is, our range is, maybe we're going to be a little bit looser, but what it ultimately means is that those kind of things are going to change. Like we're going to be more open to things like 7-6 of diamonds or 6-5 of diamonds when we're this deep, or set mining becomes much more part of like the kinds of things that we might try to do in these early stages versus like when we're getting down to it on a bubble and there's like stacks are shorter and ICM is kind of coming into play. So it's less about, I think, should I play tighter? Should I play looser? It's more about what kinds of hands do I feel like I can go on a play multi-street in a very deep stack way. It's a lot like thinking about how you might approach a cash game in some ways. There's still tournament elements that we have to consider, but it's certainly closer to cash game play than other parts of kind of tournament play. That's how I'd answer. I'd be curious how anyone else would answer that.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from some other folks on the panel here. It does sound like it's going to be looking for hands that benefit from a larger SPR or a stack to pot ratio that you won't be able to play later in tournaments. Kim, you first, and then Keith, I think.
Yeah. One of the things that we went over at the Solve for Why Academy when I was there recently this year was that you don't want to play hands as much in multi-way pots like 7-6 suited, 5-6 suited, because you can just get over flushed on those hands or over straighted on those hands. But you do want to play hands that will make a nutted hand like pairs and suited aces. And, a lot of suited broadways you would probably want to play as well. So I think you're sort of a little bit tighter, but a little bit. So you're not like a lot of people will just call. Someone will raise and they'll call early in a tournament because they have so many chips. And you should probably just play a little bit tighter and either fold or raise instead of just calling, unless your hand can make the nuts, right? So I think people play too many hands early in tournaments. And I also think, when you flop something, the thing is, when you flop something like top pair, top kicker, are you comfortable getting in 100 big blinds? Probably not, if that's all you have and all the chips are going in. But if you've got 30 big blinds, totally okay to get in with top pair, top kicker. So people can end up spewing a lot of chips early, whereas they, later in the tournament, like I find it difficult to play in the early stages because I've never been a cash game player, and I feel like I spew chips around doing exactly those kinds of things. So what they sort of were guiding us to do is, instead of calling, just either fold or raise. So if you have king jack offsuit, and instead of calling, just raise, or if you have queen jack suited, like instead of calling, just raise it, so maybe some more of that we'll see tonight from me.
Yeah, I like that. Keith?
Yeah, I agree with Kim in that hand selection is pretty important, and you don't want to get stuck in basically playing bingo with the rest of your bingo players that you're sitting there with. You want to win those pots, and because, like, say, if you're sitting there in the first level and you got 200 big blinds in your stack, do you want to get 200 big blinds in with bottom set when the guy wants to play real bad? Is that a cooler or is that a misplay? I think that's a fair question.
Mhm.
Red Chip Poker, remember a podcast years back where they said 100 big blinds, that's a cooler. 200 big blinds, you misplayed it. That's a problem. And there's other hands like that that you can get in for 200 big blinds and make a mistake because you have a flush, like Chris said. I think that your most important work in the early stages of a tournament is just watching the other players if you're playing live. Look and see how they see the game. If there's any tells, that's the time to learn about their folding tells, especially if the person on your left is holding his 2 cards a little above the table when he plans to fold, or whatever their tell is. This is the time to do it so that you can take advantage of it later. But I think you will play more hands in the early levels of a tournament than you would in a cash game, even if for, say, 100 big blinds, because the cash game is raked and you don't want to play some marginal type hands. You don't want to get into marginal hands when you're going to have to pay a rake to play them. So you play very tight ranges in a cash game. And the spewier your game, the tighter your ranges need to be. But we're talking about tournaments here, but so that's another point entirely. But yeah, you don't want to sit there and limp behind with 6 other players, so that the dealer says we got 6 players, and out comes the flop, and you're one of those 6. You don't want to get in those situations. That's bingo.
Yeah. I really like that point, Keith, about sort of recognizing how interested your opponent is in the hand. And when you're playing big pots, set over set, flush over flush, like Kim was saying there, those kind of spots can come up. And so knowing when to pot control and when to push, it makes a big difference when stacks are deep. And like Chris says, you might not even, when stacks start getting short, how many hands have meaningful betting patterns right through the river when you're starting with 20 or 30 big blinds? It's hardly any of them. So that's another thing about early tournament levels is arguably there's a bit more of a skill edge to the experienced players because they have a lot more post-flop play in order to see what mistakes the less experienced players are making and to capitalize on that. So that makes a lot of sense. And Keith, I like your note about sort of taking notes on players and getting a sense of those baselines for the tells that we might use later to find out whether they're strong or weak. I think it was a Solve for Why. Was it Matt at Solve for Why that had that really excellent seminar on different tournament stages and how you get more aggressive in different ones? I'm sure that'll be a theme of what we're going over for the next few months. One of the things that's kind of evolved a little bit is the notion about ICM not being a factor at all in early tournament stages. I know if Rob Washam was here, he would talk about how in their book study recently, they've gotten into sort of the fact that ICM is a factor. It's just not a big factor. It's not something that should be impacting your ranges or your sizings as much early in the tournament. But you still don't want to lose. You don't want to lose that bottom chip. It's still valuable. Panelists, I wonder, when it comes to like rebuy tournaments or re-entry tournaments, do you guys and gals have a different approach to how risk averse you get in them, or are you willing to shove lighter or to call lighter or to take more flips when it's a rebuy or a re-entry as opposed to a freeze out? I know theoretically we should be treating each buy-in as its own separate investment. But practically speaking, I'd love if anyone here's in this position. Do you feel like you get a little looser or more gambly if it's a rebuy, or maybe as the rebuy period's about to close, if you get to a really short stack, is there some argument for trying to run it up a bit? Because if you bust, you can still re-enter and get maybe even a bigger stack than you're playing right now. John.
I don't know that it makes any mathematical sense. In other words, I don't know that it's a plus EV move. But if I'm particularly if it's been a while since I've played, I'm sitting at the place and I'm looking to play poker, and I know that it's very likely that I'm just about ready to bust shortly after the rebuy period, I will push it that last 10 to 15 minutes to try to build up a working stack or rebuy again, assuming that the tournament is a small buy-in value, so it's not going to be a significant amount and things like that. And I don't think that is plus EV, but it may be plus life EV.
Yes. I like that. Well, and I think I do the same thing. And I mean, what people will tell us, John, I think, is that we're not appreciating the value that our stack has, that even having a short stack is valuable, and we shouldn't throw it away at the chance of getting a bigger stack. But I mean, ultimately, that's what we're doing every time we go all in with a short stack. We're gambling it away on the chance to get a bigger stack. Chris, what do you have to say?
Well, one thing I would say about the rebuy thing is it's I mean, we should sort of know what we're going to try to, how many we're willing to fire into whatever. But I think one of the biggest things to be able to discern is maybe not am I going to get more gambly? What's going to help me decide that is if I can tell, or if I already know that there are players at my table who are trying to they want to run it up or rebuy, right?
Yeah.
So they're going to have a completely different strategy to somebody who's just hoping to find the good hand, survive, get through, make the bubble, make the money, versus somebody who's they've got 5 buy-ins in their pocket and they're ready to fire. That is really helpful to know, because against that player, I'm much more likely to call down lighter, to take chances against them, take those ones that might be flips. In some of those cases, I may be dominating where I think I should only be flipping. And so those are the kinds of things I want to be sort of aware of if I can figure them out.
Joe, you unmuted for a second there. Do you have something you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think it was very similar to what Chris said, is that it's almost this weird kind of bubble effect when that time kind of rolls in, because you just kind of look around the table and see, well, who's got the short stack, who's likely to try to force something that if I hit a hand that maybe I can pick up some EV, and if I bust, then I can rebuy if I want. So I do think there's some weirdness to it, and if you treat it sort of like a bubble, you might be able to bully some people around that who might come in, even if you're I would presume that if you, and panelists tell me if I'm wrong, but if you're a big stack, bullying some people around might not be a terrible thing at that particular point in the tournament. So,
Keith?
Yeah. One point I want to add is just the overall management of your bankroll that way. If you traveled for a tournament, say you traveled out to Las Vegas, it's expensive to travel there, you might want to take more chances, because if you bust out and can rebuy, that's like getting more tournaments for your travel buck. You're spreading your it's like spreading your travel expenses across several tournaments. That doesn't mean you make fishy, spewy plays, but consider making more big plays than you normally would, say, in your home game.
That's cool. I like Joe's. It's actually like an anti-bubble, isn't it, Joe? It's like instead of people tightening up, people start getting a little spewy. So we're in the anti-bubble. Maybe has that been trademarked yet? Let's see.
Anti-bubble. I did want to say something along the lines of Keith's comment, which I think is more in my wheelhouse than tournament poker, but from a psychological standpoint, I think consider what you would, when you go on a long trip, consider what it is that you want first to gain from this trip, right? And plan for how much that you want to fire at a tournament, because the problem with firing bullets at a tournament is there can be no end. And even though tournaments are, limiting your exposure more so than cash, the variance is so much higher. If you start firing away, you can very quickly find yourself blowing through money and not having much advantage over that. And if what you really want is to play maybe late reg for the tournament or something else so that it can limit it. But just have a good idea in terms of what it is that you want to do at that bubble, because it can be very tempting once you've busted to simply fire that bullet again. And it may be money that you just didn't intend to spend on poker at that point.
Yeah, great point. Particularly online. Well, I guess there's pros and cons for online and live in those cases. It's much easier to register again online, but live, you have to drive home if you don't. So that's a different incentives. And the last thing I did want to talk about, unless anyone else on the panel has anything they want to add here, is the notion that Joe just brought up about late registering. So this is something that people have studied this a lot. I think you might actually be plus EV. Most players are going to be plus EV to register late with a shorter chip stack. A lot of players have already busted by the time you're getting close to the end of registration. So those are all players that you don't have to beat. It's true that you've got a shorter chip stack, but if you're worried about not being the most skilled or experienced player at the table, having a shorter chip stack kind of neutralizes that advantage that the savvier, more experienced, better players have. So there's nothing wrong with that either. You don't get to experience the time spent in the tournament for as long. And so something like the main event or some other prestigious thing or one of your first tournaments or something like that, I'd always encourage folks to register on time and enjoy the whole thing. But once you've, played a few tournaments and you're really looking to kind of like improve your hourly rate and, I think there's a lot of arguments for registering late. I know it's become a more sort of strategically sound tactic that a lot of players are using. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. Oh, here, Joe, one more thing before we go.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when you're looking on advice online, keep in mind where it's coming from, because I think a lot of times people get very wrapped up in a particular line of advice that doesn't take what Jim was saying into account concerning whether life EV versus financial EV makes sense. Late registering for a tournament means you may not play for very long. But then, for a lot of pros, they're like, well, I'm done. I fired my bullets and I'm done for the day. Whereas if what you're doing, as Keith said, was to drive up and play for a long time, well, that's not going to be very enjoyable for you. And you may want to register more early. So just be very clear in terms of what you want, and then make sure you know when the advice is coming in about late registering, where it's coming from, and what they think your goals are for your poker play.
Great clarification, Joe. And we do have one more comment in the chat here from Ben Enslow, talking about early tournament stages and playing deep stack. He says, I get too sticky with those kind of hands like King Jack offsuit and 7-6 suited when I make a pair, and I lose chips that way. And that's right. And this is something I want to reinforce to everyone who's playing deep stack poker. One pair is not your friend. And you don't play a hand like, and I know Ben knows this, but just for everyone else who's listening, you don't play 7-6 suited to make a pair. Making a pair is usually a terrible outcome when you play 7-6 suited, and that goes for all these kind of middle pair no kicker hands. You really need to crush 2 pair plus for that. That's why you're trying to make straight draws and flush draws that you can play aggressively on future streets. And Kim's got the really excellent point about doing it with those ace high flush draws, those king high flush draws, like king queen suited, ace wheel aces, that kind of thing that can make the nuts, and pocket pairs that can make sets that are very, very difficult to beat. So that's all good advice about deep stack poker. One pair. You can look at this yourself. I'll just say one more short tangent. If you're looking in Poker Tracker yourself, you can see you can query your database to see the tendencies of your player pool. And typically what happens is that one pair is a winning hand at pots up to 40 or 50 big blinds. And then after that, once you're playing pots for more than 50 or 60 big blinds, one pair starts to show up as a loser as often as it shows up as a winner when you get to showdown. And hands like 2 pair plus start to become winners at pot sizes like that. And like Keith was saying earlier, if someone wants to play a big pot with you, they probably have 1 pair beat. They might even have 2 pair beat. They might even have bottom set beat. And so you really got to think about what is the relative strength of your hand for the situation and not the absolute strength of your hand. One more comment from Luke O in the YouTube chat says, I find early reg gives you more chance to wait for that nutted hand and get stacks in against someone who is firing a bullet. Yeah, exactly. If you get a sense of like who's out there to go and take a stab, and you can pick your spots, and if it's a nice structure and you're deep and you can afford to fold for a while and wait for those nutted hands or those extremely strong hands, that's exactly it. And one thing that's come out of this conversation from a bunch of people, I think, is the importance of knowing what your opponents are thinking about. Are they thinking about doubling up? Are they thinking about busting and going home? And how's that going to affect who you can apply pressure against and who you can't? So, Chris, thank you so much for putting these amazing deep dive seminars together. This one is early stages. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the theme of the month in September is a slightly later stage than early stages. I'm getting the nod.
Well, yeah, because wait, I'm so lost on. So is this coming up in August is the one we've already put in the can. This is coming out in September, right?
Yes, that's right.
So then, so October will be those next stages of the tournament.
All right, and if anyone's listening to this podcast and it didn't come out in the right month, you can send your complaint email to jim@rec.poker. Let me know, and I'll try and line this up better for next time. But we do record these forums editions slightly out of sync with the rest of them, so it's possible that I get the dates wrong every once in a while. But this was a good one. Thanks, Chris, for all you do for putting this stuff together. Thank you to Keith and Kim and John and Joe for participating. It's fun to do these on YouTube, so thanks to Phil and Luke and Ben for chatting along in there. Thanks, of course, to the Running Aces Hotel, Racetrack, and Casino. And to you, the listeners. You're the best. We'll see you again next week. Thanks for tuning in.